This is 11 honors. Everybody's here, but I still wanted to record this. Would you say that again? The two stories?
The first one, the kids, it was like make-believe, and they weren't gonna actually do it, but the second one, they were like threatening to do it, and they could.
Right. And so that's two views of the world right there. The romantic view, kind of make-believe view, that's Tom Sawyer. You're just having fun and games. And the realistic view, which is Huck Finn, this is real. Just like killing the pig and pretending that he was killed and all that, that was real. Tom Sawyer's are just games. And that's how Mark Twain views the difference. It's question, where is it? It's question number 10 on the review sheet. Difference between realism and romanticism in Huck Finn. There are two examples right there. This story juxtaposed with the story of the little boy. One is just games for fun, harmless. But the real world is where Huck lives, all right? Oh, yeah, number 3. What do Jim and Huck plan to do when they get to Cairo, Illinois? Like, they do have a plan. They are floating in what direction?
North? Wait.
Like, which way does the Mississippi River run? Does it run north, or does it run north to south, or south to north?
Isn't it south?
Well, that would be from, in other words, from New Orleans, it floats toward Minnesota, because that's where the end of the Mississippi River is. Most rivers in the world, I think all of them except the Nile River, run north to south. The Nile River runs from south to north. It's an anomaly. It's one of a kind.
So how do they get to the free states if they're floating?
What?
How do they get to the free states if they're floating?
That's the question I'm getting at. Well, that's the rich irony here. They're trying to be free, but what direction are they floating? And what's south of them? Like, what if they keep floating south? What's waiting them?
Slave states.
Yeah. Now remember, Missouri is a slave state, but the real slave states, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, those are the deep South slave states. And so they're going in wrong. So when they get to Cairo, Illinois, I wish I had a map. Can you picture any of this? Like, in your head, do you have a map of the United States and you can see the Mississippi River running? Yeah, sure. You see the Mississippi River running this way. When you get to the tip of Illinois, that's Cairo, Illinois. It's right on the tip. And the Ohio River runs into the Mississippi that way. So in my mind, I can see this. So you got Illinois, the Ohio River running east to west, runs into the Mississippi. So when they get to Cairo, remember they want to be free. So what's the best place to go to be free in America in 1850?
Free states.
Which are? Like which part of the country are the free states in? What? And even then, they have the fugitive slave law. So if you really want to be free, what's the best bet? Like, what's the most northern place in North America you can go before you get to the North Pole?
Oh. North America?
Yeah, what's north of the United States? What's north of Maine? There's a whole country up there called Canada. And so slaves would escape to Canada in order to be free. And so the idea was that they would get to Cairo. Now, how are you going to go up a river that flows against you? You can't float up a river. So in 1850, what is the only means of going up a river? Steamboat. So they were going to get tickets on a steamboat and sail up the Ohio and eventually make his way maybe to Canada. You know what is his ultimate goal? What's Jim's ultimate goal?
To free his family.
Yes. So he definitely doesn't want to stay there. He wants to come back. So that's significant. Just make a note of that. Number 3, they're looking for Cairo. And if they go past Cairo, they're in trouble. Oh, yeah, look at number 4. How do Huck and the canoe and Jim on the raft lose each other? That would be, well, we're kind of going quickly, but we'll just go in order here. What happens when that happens? How do they, what does Jim and Huck do? What does Huck in the canoe and Jim on the raft, how do they lose each other? Well, I mentioned that chapter, this is why that's very helpful, chapter 16, 14, which is it? Chapter 15 I call the fog, because they get lost in the fog. So that's number 4. Do you remember what, this is important, do you remember what Huck does with that when they get lost in the fog?
He falls asleep.
Who?
Huck does. Or like he like looks for him, or he's trying to listen to him.
Right.
But then he's like, it's no use, so he takes a nap and then he ends up sleeping.
And he eventually finds Jim, and Jim is asleep on the raft. This is because, they got separated earlier. And what does Huck do with that? That he lies down, and Jim had been on the raft sometime in the fog alone, and Huck had been alone on the canoe, and now Huck is now on the raft, but Jim doesn't know it yet. So Jim wakes up, and there's Huck. What does Huck do with that?
He makes him think, doesn't he like trick him or something?
He does.
Makes him think it was like a dream.
Yes, very good. He makes him feel like it's a dream, and eventually it becomes clear that to Jim that it wasn't a dream. How does Jim react to that?
He like walks away or like swims away or something.
Because he's upset with Huck. Why is he upset with Huck? Because Jim was really worried about Huck. He thought he was worried for Huck's safety. And then Huck makes it into a joke. What does Huck do for the first time?
He feels bad.
He does what?
Doesn't he like feel bad?
He feels bad. No, he felt bad earlier when he tricked him.
Doesn't he like apologize?
He apologizes. Did any of you watch Andy Griffith? Okay. There was a scene last night. I mean, this scene could never be made. It's terrible in a way, but it's about Ellie running for city council, and because she's a woman, they don't want her to run. So it's very, we would say, sexist. But at one point, one of the characters says, "You never apologize to a woman." And immediately, this book reminded me that was the way it was in 1850 if someone was a slave, or any black man or woman. You wouldn't apologize. What does that say if you would say something like that? You never apologize to this certain group. What kind of attitude does that convey?
You don't respect.
No, it's complete lack of respect. And so, Huck, I'll read part of it with you. It's right at the very end of chapter 15. It was 15, I won't use the N word, but it was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a slave, but I'd done it. And I wasn't sorry for it afterwards neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks. I wouldn't have done that one if I'd have known it made him feel that way. So for the first time in the book, he apologizes to a black man. He had never done that in his life. That's an example of number 9 on the review sheet. Huck Finn is a dynamic character. He's changing. And we've charted that from the first trick he played to the snakeskin trick and now to the fog trick. He now feels sorry for somebody for hurting their feelings, all right, so the next chapter is chapter 16. And we're looking at question number 5. Huck's conscience begins to trouble him for helping a runaway slave escape. What does Huck resolve to do?
He's gonna turn him in.
he's gonna turn him in. He actually sees some slave catchers. Now, why does he feel, we just said he was changing. He begins to respect Jim, but why does his conscience hurt him? Isn't that what you said? What's he feel bad about?
Doing something that he feels isn't right,
Yeah, what does he feel is not right?
freeing his life.
Yes, and what does that say about his attitude toward slavery?
I think it's kind of, wasn't in the beginning, he was just like, it was the law,
Yeah,
and so he believed it, and now he's kind of towards that after he apologized to Jim, he realizes that slaves shouldn't be taken like that.
because he's helping Jim escape, and he feels really bad about that. And he's thinking about Ms. Watson, who owns Jim. And he says, she never did anything bad to me, and what bad thing is he doing for Ms. Watson?
He ran away.
Taking property, this Ms. Watson, it's like stealing property. Jim is property to slave owners, all right? So, he resolves to turn him in, but he doesn't. And why doesn't he? These slave catchers and they even asked him, I'll try to find, yeah, I don't know what page it is for you, but he sees these slave catchers and they ask, well, there's 5 slaves run off tonight up yonder above the head. Is your man white or black? He's talking about Jim. He's saying Jim is sick. And why is he now changing his mind about turning him in?
He's grown attached to Jim. Is it because he's grown attached to Jim?
That's right. It further shows his changing. He likes Jim. He cannot hurt Jim. He doesn't. Slavery is just fine, but this is Jim. That's different. Jim's my friend. Even though he's a slave, he doesn't connect those two things. He just, I'm going to help. So he cannot turn him in. The last thing Huck, Jim said to him, I was paddling off, and before he sees the slave catchers, Jim says, there you go, the old true Huck, the only white gentleman that ever kept his promise to old Jim. So he was just talking about how much he was telling Huck, well, you've been such a friend to me, and while Huck is planning to turn him in, he can't do it. And he makes up this elaborate story about Jim. Do you remember how, we don't have time for that, but you remember how he handles it? He says he's got smallpox, and so they don't want to go in there, and so that's what happens. So that's number 6. They miss Cairo. They realize they're looking for Cairo. That's their plan. They miss it. How did they miss it?
They skip it?
What?
Did they go past?
They do, but what caused them to go past it? Something that just happened in the book.
The fog.
The fog. In the fog, at some point, they pass Cairo. Now, what's their problem? They floated, who knows how far past Cairo. What's their problem?
They don't know how to get back.
But they can't get back. You can't float up the river. So they plan to ditch the raft and hail, like you would hail a cab in New York City, to hail a steamboat and get on it. But they now have, their plan has been foiled. Look at number 8. What do both of them say is the reason this happened? They would call it bad luck. What's the reason for this bad luck?
Snake skin.
The snake skin. It shows you that there's still superstition. Remember the snake skin? And every bad thing now that happens to them, they blame it on the snake skin. And number 9, and this goes back to what we heard from the beginning, that they are floating one night, and what What causes them to overturn? Delaney, what causes them to overturn?
Number 9.
Yeah. Do you remember what it was? You got it. You told me at the beginning. The raft overturns.
They like washed over.
Yeah. But what was it that caused them to have to jump off the raft? And it was a steamboat. The steamboat coming down at night tries to run over them. That's what steamboats would do. The pilot of the steamboat would find a raft, and like maybe there used to be this thing called chicken. Have you ever heard that? Could be anywhere, but cars used to see how you get the clothes without hitting the other guy. And so that's what happens. And so that's when the last 2 chapters start. There's a lot here we're not going to be able to go over. I'm going to check the time. We still got a few minutes, but let's see. Let's see, 1:05. So we have about 15 minutes. So we went up through number 9. Just flip that. Okay, flip it to the next page. We'll come back eventually and talk about those. Chapter 17 through 18. Tell me about the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons. When Huck gets thrown off the raft, he finds himself in front of a house. And what happened? Anybody tell me that story?
Took him. Oh, they tried to kill him, or because they thought he was a shepherd.
Yes.
Or what is the other one?
That's it.
And they took him in, and then they gave him dry clothes and like helped him after they got him.
All that's true. So we answered number 1. It says, when Huck first meets the Grangerfords, what details suggest the family is living in a state of siege? Like they try to almost shoot him. Why? It's this kid out in the woods, harmless boy. Why would they want to shoot him? Because they're in a feud with the Shepherdsons, and they think he may be a Shepherdson. So this is a very interesting part of the story. They have a young son who's the exact same age as Huck, and his name is Buck. And so they're almost like twins from 2 different, families. They're the same age, their names almost exactly the same. They really have a lot in common. You can almost say Buck is Huck's foil, because he's almost exactly like him, and yet he's so different. All right, so look at number 3. Who is Emmeline Grangerford? And there's so much we could do with this, but do you know who she is? There are 3 children. Well, the 3 children that have names. Emmeline, I can't remember the girl who gets married. Do you remember Mary? What was her name? The one who was going to get married. I'll come back to that. I can't remember her name. But anyway, and then Buck. So who is Emmeline? All right, this is question number 3. Emmeline was the daughter who had died. She was sick, and she was dead. You remember what they do with her for her memory?
Take a picture of her.
They keep her room just like it always was. It's like she never left. That's an example. You could argue, I'm not going to criticize any family that loses a child and wants to preserve that room, or just like it was when they were alive. I wouldn't criticize anybody for doing that. I'd probably do that too if it happened to me. But I think Mark Twain is kind of criticizing. I think he's saying they took this a little too far. I'm not going to judge anybody who would really do that. But what's interesting about her? She's dead, so she's gone, although they've preserved the room. What is Huck's attitude toward her? She spent her time doing 2 things. What were they? When she was living? Art and poetry. And in both cases, what was the subject that she most enjoyed writing and drawing about? We just said the family is in a state of siege. They're in this feud. So what would be a good guess if you don't remember? Like, what is the subject that she writes about and she draws about? She writes poems about it and she draws pictures of it. Death. She's obsessed with death, which is interesting because that's when she was living. And then she's the first, well, she's not the first one to die. But she's obsessed with death. Now, why would that be appropriate if you were a Grangerford living in a family that's in a feud with another family?
So you think your family died?
That's all you know. All you know is people, your family getting shot, shooting other people, war, constant war. That's number 3. Number 4, the colonel, he's the Colonel Granger, he's the boss, yes, sure. Do you remember him? Huck really admires him. He's tall, well-dressed, and quiet, and kind, but also scary. He's like Colonel Sanders. Have you seen, remember Colonel Sanders, the Kentucky Fried Chicken? You ever seen his? Okay. That's a make-believe person, but I picture somebody like that. Somebody, dressed really well, and Huck really admires him. Yeah.
Do you think I can go to the bathroom when she gets back?
Yeah. All right, look at number 5. Huck, how does Huck regard the entire Grangerford family?
Doesn't he like admire them?
He admires them. And I said from the beginning that Huck often admires things that you and I and Mark Twain do not admire. So he admires this family, and we can look at it as a bloodthirsty crime family. Do you admire, did you ever see what was the name of that? The Godfather? I've seen portions of it. I don't like stories about the mafia. But you're fascinated. You start watching, you can't stop. This is a crime family. And they look respectable. They go to church. They love each other. They love each other. But they're murderers. And that's what this family is. They're very respectful. They go to church. They love each other. And yet they're murderers. And number 6, why does Shepherds and Grangers not get along? Because they're in a feud. Do you know what started the feud?
Someone killed someone?
Yes, but do you know what started, why that happened? They don't either. They don't remember for sure why they're fighting each other. Buck doesn't know. So we've always done it. That's why we're doing it now. What started, why do you hate them? Because they're Shepherdsons. Yeah, but why do you hate Shepherdsons? I guess they're Shepherdsons. That's not an answer, but that's all he knows. You remember who's hiding? Somebody that we haven't seen in about a chapter. One of the slaves takes Huck to the swamp, and guess who's in the swamp? Jim. So Jim is there waiting. He's got the raft, and so Huck has got to figure out a way to get away now so they can leave. Number 8. Who is Harney Shepherdson?
He's like one of the people in the Shepherdson clan, and he's like young, and they like run into him, pluck her out, and he like and Buck like shoots at him. Yeah.
Yes.
It's like,
And you can add to that, that, what's his name again? Harney. Harney wants to marry Sophia. And I think it ended Sophia, yeah. Sophia is the older sister. And so a shepherd's son wants to marry a Grangerford. What does that make you think of?
Romeo and Juliet.
It's Romeo and Juliet. And so that's why they start fighting again. And we'll go to number 10. How does Huck get involved in it? Like, what was his role in? He didn't mean to, but something that he did helped start the fighting anew between the Shepherds and the Grangerfords. You remember what it was? So if I asked Huck after church one day to go to the church because she left her Bible there. He goes to the church, and why does she want the Bible?
Does it have a note
It does,
from
it's,
Harney
and then it say,
when to meet?
that's right, so they could elope. And so Huck doesn't know what he's doing, he's just being kind, and yet that's what helps start this thing. They do run away, and the two families start to kill each other. And we leave this back in question number 11. What happens to Buck? Buck gets shot and killed. Now there's a lot to be said here. We have 8 minutes to do it, but you have now some more additional information that you need to answer number 8, 9, 10, and 14. No, not 8. Yes, 8. And so we don't have to do it all right now, but I would argue that for 14, this is the most violent chapter in the book. 2 chapters. All right, so the feud is an example of violence, and they don't even know why they're fighting. And number 8, sentimentalism plays a role in it. Remember, what did we say sentimentalism is? This is going to be on the exam.
What was the question?
It's question 8 on the review sheet. It's not a question, but what is sentimentalism?
It's like using emotions to change someone's thoughts.
So to manipulate, and it's overly emotional too. It's false, and it's extreme. So if you just lose it when you watch a movie, that could be considered sentimentalism. What did we say yesterday is the problem with sentimentalism? If you're crying, what are you not doing? You're not thinking. And there's a time to cry, and there's a time to think. And if you're crying when you should be thinking, you're in trouble. And that's part of the argument that he's making here. These people are sentimental, and they're not thinking. What's an example of they're not thinking? What caused the feud? They don't know. They don't care. They're not thinking. They just do it. They hate them. They're blinded by their hate, and they're not thinking. Is this really necessary? Should we really be fighting these people? So that's an example in the book of sentimentalism, and it's the problems of sentimentalism. Can I just point out one other thing? If you'll go back to chapter 12 through 16, we got all the way down to to 10. So let's look at 10, 11, and 12. All right, and I think that'll be it. 10, you learn that the wrecked steamboat is named Walter Scott. Why might this allusion to Sir Walter Scott remind you of Tom Sawyer? What kind of books did Tom Sawyer like? Adventure books, and that's what Sir Walter Scott wrote. And so this is like a literary joke that Mark Twain is giving us right here. He's joking, and because he's got the Walter Scott is sunk, like the whole idea of those kinds of books are, it's a negative thing to say about it. All right, look at 11. Compared to the way Tom Sawyer treated little Tommy Barnes for threatening to tell all the secrets of the gang, with the way Bill and Jake deal with Jim Turner for the same offense. We've already answered that. One is real. Those guys on the ship there, that's real life. Tommy Barnes, that's just games. And that's how Mark Twain sees the difference between realism and sentimentalism or romanticism. Finally, what evidence can you find that Huck is not sentimental about the gang's plight? What's going to happen to the gang if they have no means of getting off the ship in a fog? They're going to die. I meant flood, not fog. Yes, they're going to die. And so I would say, what's the evidence that Huck is not too worried about that?
He doesn't help them.
He does the opposite, doesn't he?
He takes their boat.
He takes their boat and doesn't worry about the fact, what are they going to do? And can I just ask you to write down one thing? This is one of my favorite lines in the book. This is the last line. Make that the first line of chapter 13. If you want to turn there, or you can write it down. This is proof that Huck is not sentimental. Like, he's not thinking, what's good? It's either them or us. If we don't take it, we'll die. Why should we die? You know, that he's very practical about it. Look at the first line of chapter 13. Well, I catch my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it weren't no time to be sentimentary. That's the line I wanted to point out to you, that it weren't no time to be sentimental. That's what he means. Sentimental is when you ignore the reality and focus on the emotions. And the next to last paragraph in that chapter, I'm going to give you some more evidence. Huck does actually try to help him once he gets off the ship. Do you remember what he tries to do?
He looks for a man.
Yeah, he tries to find somebody who will go out there and get them before the ship sinks, and he can't find anybody to do that. And so he eventually looks up, and there goes the wrecked steamboat floating down the river, which means they probably are not going to survive. And this is what Huck said. In fact, he rowed out there with his canoe and yelled, and nobody answered. So the guys were in the water, they were already dead, who knows. And this is what Huck said. I pulled around her and hollered a little, and there wasn't no answer, all dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckon if they could stand it, I could. He just admits that I felt a little bad about it, but not too bad. That's the opposite of being sentimental. Sentimental is you can't get something off your mind and you keep crying and crying and crying. That, Huck or Mark Twain would say, is absurd. That it's over. Get over it. You know, let's put it behind us. Let's move on. That's what Huck is like. So we have answered additionally more about 8, a little more about 9, more about 10, and more about 14. So you know enough to answer and I promise you 2 of those 4 will be on the exam, the written exam. At least one of those will be on the written exam. So we'll come in tomorrow, and you can have some time tomorrow to ask questions about the other one. I know you missed some of that, but fortunately,
Yeah, I'll watch this week.